What happened to John F. Kennedy's 3 grandchildren? The world remembers Camelot as a fairy tale, a family of charisma, power, and perfect smiles. But behind the cameras, behind the pretty faces, there were secrets that could make a normal person throw up. Decisions made decades ago left traumas that no wealth or fame could erase. In this script, we will tell you all about the hidden curse of the Kennedy family, all of the addiction and cruelty that continued, and finally passed on to the grandchildren who inherited consequences instead of a dream. They taught the country a story, and the story stuck. A handsome young senator on the cover of magazines, a glamorous wife who could make silence look like an act of statecraft, children who seemed to belong to a happier America. The photographs were everywhere, and they asked nothing of us beyond belief, and belief was easily given. The first part of this 4-part arc begins by taking that photograph out of the frame and walking around the room until you can see the fingerprints on the glass. The goal here is not to shout scandal. The goal is to show the quiet work of damage done out of sight, the small choices that built a ruin. People trusted the myth because it made them feel safer. What they did not know was how carefully safety had been manufactured. Long before headlines and televised hearings, there was a wound inside the family that nobody fixed, because fixing would have meant exposing the family itself. Rosemary was the eldest daughter, and she was not what her parents expected. She spoke in ways that did not fit the era's tidy categories. She failed at exercises that should have been ordinary. She behaved in ways that in private became intolerable because the public image could not accommodate difference. Her father found a medical fix that promised order. The operation in 1941 left her unable to function the way she had before. She was moved away. The story around her changed from the truth to an explaining lie, and for decades the family's public face remained spotless, while one of its members lived in an institution. The choice to hide was a choice that cost a life of ordinary things most families take for granted. Those early decisions taught the rest of the family a grammar for silence. Reputation became an instrument, and secrets the price of keeping that instrument tuned. Children learned by example that when something is visible, you apply power to the problem. When something is private, you conceal it. The consequences of this grammar show up in small mercies withheld, and in large cruelties that are rationalized by a sentence. We cannot let this be known. That sentence was spoken in different rooms at different times, and it shaped the next generation. The lesson was not spoken aloud. It transmitted itself through dinners where certain topics evaporated, through trips abroad where stories were arranged so nothing would leak. Those arrangements were not neutral. They were active work to protect an idea. The family's sons grew up surrounded by resources, and by the implicit rule that the name could be protected at virtually any cost. One son fought in darkness that would later be labeled addiction. Another married and found solace in the wrong places. These were private collapses that the public never saw because the family apparatus was built to funnel trouble away from headlines. Addiction did not look like drama on the page. It looked like a boy disappearing down flights of stairs to rooms where adults pretended not to know. It looked like parents who could secure doctors and institutions and reputations in ways most people could not. The machinery that kept the name pristine also made decisions that treated children as liabilities to be managed rather than people to be saved. That machinery left wounds in the sons that would later radiate outward. Power in the household also produced bizarre behaviors that read like folklore until you find them corroborated in memory. The family had falconers and collections and habits that should have been private, but which reveal a capacity to normalize the grotesque once privacy becomes absolute. There are accounts from close relatives who describe acts that make the skin crawl, descriptions of animal carcasses kept for reasons explained as tradition, explanations that evaporate when you meet the detail with the light of a memory. These stories do not function as mere salaciousness. They matter because when cruelty is normalized under the guise of eccentricity, it signals tolerance for harm in other forms. When a family lets cruelty persist privately, it trains children to either replicate cruelty or to carry its shame. Marriage entered the house with its own set of instructions. Women were expected to be servants of the family's softer face, quietly smoothing rifts and absorbing embarrassments. They were not expected to be saviors. Some married believing they could save a man. Some believed public affection would erase private harm. The pattern is not unique to this family. but the scale of their resources made the pattern lethal in a particular way. When an entire household can hire silence, silence becomes a commodity, and the person who needs help is routinely priced out of rescue. What emerges from those arrangements is a house where children learn that protection of the brand is the welfare priority, while personal welfare is negotiable. That negotiation has long-term effects that you begin to see in grandchildren who inherit not only a name, but a system for surviving with a wound. By the time the sons of the Kennedy household entered adolescence, they already understood the unspoken rules of survival. Appearances were sacred, consequences were negotiable, and privilege could shield almost anything. But what happens when that shield removes all restraint, not only for humans, but for everything around them? One story begins with hawks. The family kept them as pets and status symbols, but their care went far beyond feeding and observation. According to multiple accounts from close relatives, the birds were sometimes used as instruments for testing obedience or for private amusement, and the boys would watch as small animals, mice, rabbits, were released into enclosures only to be hunted. They observed the chase, the struggle, and the kill, not as a lesson in natural predation, but as entertainment, a rehearsal in power over life and death. It was early exposure to control that required no moral reasoning. Then there was the infamous blender incident. One of the younger sons had acquired small birds, reportedly parakeets and finches, and placed them inside a blender to see what would happen. Accounts from family members describe it not as a moment of malice, but as a moment of experimentation. The air in the room shifted afterward, not because anyone intervened, but because adults, trained to preserve image over conscience, looked away. The lesson was internalized. The boys learned that cruelty could be abstracted, compartmentalized, and safely ignored, especially when adults demonstrated the same disregard. The whale incident was something else entirely. During a family road trip, a juvenile whale had washed ashore, and the boys, teenagers armed with confidence and entitlement, participated in dragging the carcass onto the roof of the car. Accounts suggest they posed for photos, laughed, and treated it as a legend in the making. Neighbors and passers-by noticed, but the family's social power insulated them from complaint. To the sons, this was a signal. The world bends to legacy, even when the act itself defies reason. The bear, too, became a private story retold later. One winter, a bear carcass was procured and moved to the family estate. It was stored in a garage and eventually staged for one of the adults' eccentric displays. The sons were part of the effort, carrying and arranging the body, learning to treat life and death as raw material for spectacle. Each act built on the other, a chain linking privilege to impunity, detachment to entitlement, and amusement to normalization of harm. But it was not only about animals. These acts intersected with the human landscape of addiction, secrecy, and relational control. One of the sons, exposed to these patterns early, developed heroin addiction while still a teenager. It was not the substance alone that defined the experience, but the infrastructure surrounding it. Rooms where he used drugs were off limits to questions. Adults covered, doctored explanations, and preserved appearances. The children watched that system in operation, learning that some behavior could be protected while its consequences remained hidden. Marriages, too, became classrooms in control and endurance. Partners entered believing love might change habits. One wife, in particular, later described cycles of violence and manipulation disguised as eccentricity, writing letters that detailed emotional erosion, missed boundaries, and the slow accumulation of fear. She died without public vindication. Her suffering became part of the lessons the grandchildren would inherit. Charm and status shield some, but not all, from the consequences of moral compromise. Inside the house, children absorbed every detail. They watched how women absorbed blame and how chaos was rationalized. They noticed that privilege could erase wrongdoing or at least move it far from public scrutiny. They internalized that family loyalty meant complicity and that the name itself could convert tragedy into story. It was a curriculum in survival, ethical ambiguity, and inheritance of secrecy. By the end of this part, the animals, the emotional manipulation, and the silent lessons converge. The sons carry forward behaviors shaped by observation and impunity. The legacy, previously an abstract ideal, has begun its tangible work. the transfer of dysfunction from one generation to the next. The grandchildren, as yet unnamed in this narrative, are already positioned to confront patterns that no amount of wealth or protection can erase. And while Part 2 ends without scandal in headlines, it lays the groundwork for the collisions that will define Part 3, the moment when legacy is no longer abstract, when inherited lessons become impossible to ignore. By the time Caroline Kennedy, John Jack Schlossberg, and Rose Schlossberg entered adulthood, the Kennedy family had already exhausted every strategy for silence. What remained was exposure without preparation. They were raised inside a house where explanations were perfected, but repair never arrived. Part 3 begins when the damage stops being inherited quietly and starts demanding attention in public. This is the stage where private history collides with modern scrutiny, and the family discovers that the old protections are no longer airtight. Caroline Kennedy stepped forward first, carrying the name like a tool. Politics offered a familiar stage, and for a moment it felt like repetition rather than risk. She campaigned for Senate and public causes with confidence, the kind that comes from growing up believing doors open when you reach for them. Early appearances went smoothly. The Kennedy name still created oxygen, but inside her campaign operation something felt unstable. Staff turnover happened quickly. Decisions were rushed. Advisors left without explanation. The image of effortless inevitability cracked, and people started noticing. Reporters did not focus only on policy. They remembered the family archive. They remembered what had been buried. They remembered how often burying had failed. Jack Schlossberg, on the other hand, pursued a quieter public life, studying law and public service, yet even he could not avoid the weight of legacy. Interviews and appearances reminded him constantly that the family history was both shield and burden. At events, he encountered questions about family scandals, past tragedies, and the infamous rumors surrounding earlier generations. He responded politely, measured, aware that every word carried historical gravity. What had been private was now semi-public. He realized quickly that privilege could no longer erase scrutiny. Rose Schlossberg faced the harshest personal trial. She had lived a life that mirrored the public's ideal image: education, independence, stability. But when she became pregnant, the moment should have closed a circle of familial expectation. Instead, it opened a trapdoor. Complications followed the birth. Then the diagnosis arrived: acute leukemia, aggressive and rare. The timetable collapsed into hospital days and medical language that stripped time of its meaning. The story became impossible to keep private because her illness required transparency. Treatment was brutal. Chemotherapy erased physical strength. Infections invaded her weakened body. Recovery became a negotiation of hours, and the public watched as she confronted mortality without the armor of performance. It was not dramatic in the way scandals are dramatic. It was worse. It was honest. At the same time, a private family conflict turned outward. A letter appeared, not anonymous, not whispered. Written by a close family member, it was intended to be read publicly. The language was precise, describing behaviors that were predatory and cruel, highlighting hypocrisy, manipulation, and failures of care. For decades, such disputes had been handled behind closed doors. This one was delivered with intent, piercing the illusion of control. Denials and minimization followed, familiar patterns now destabilized by the public eye. Screenshots replaced handshakes. The grandchildren watched authority figures perform evasions they had once been trained to absorb, now without insulation. The family's animal stories returned with force, no longer folklore. The blender incident, the hawks, the whale on the car, the bear staged for display, they formed a narrative of impulse and entitlement. Caroline and Jack, hearing these accounts publicly, confronted an inheritance they had experienced indirectly as children. Silence was no longer automatic. The stories were now evidence of a worldview where desire outweighed morality, and the grandchildren were forced to process it in real time. Rose, even in her illness, witnessed these stories circulate, each one reshaping how the public interpreted the family name. Questions began rising from within the family itself. Why had cruelty been tolerated? Why had women absorbed chaos while men were celebrated? Caroline, Jack, and Rose were confronted with knowledge their parents had carefully mediated. Their inquiries did not generate press releases, but reshaped relationships. Estrangements formed quietly, permanently altering the family's internal geography. The myth of Camelot as protection collapsed. Caroline, Jack, and Rose were adults forced to confront a legacy that provided opportunity while demanding loyalty to damage. Caroline attempted reinvention through public service. Jack tried measured engagement, and Rose fought for personal survival. None could pretend the past was decorative. The illness, letters, and public scrutiny converged into a reality no family management strategy could control. By the time everything was visible, the family had already lost the ability to control the ending. The final part is not about revelation. It is about reckoning. This is where the story stops asking what happened and starts asking what survived and what did not. The myth was never officially revoked. It simply stopped functioning. There was no single scandal that destroyed it, no courtroom verdict that closed the book. Instead, there was accumulation, illness that would not retreat, letters that refused to stay private, patterns that no longer sounded coincidental once they were aligned side by side. When people speak about a curse, they usually mean misfortune. What this family confronted was something more exacting, consequences delayed, not denied. The animal stories mattered here in a different way, not as spectacle, but as evidence. When incidents once laughed off as eccentricity were described together, they revealed a consistency. The hawks, the feedings, the blender, the whale carried across highways, the bear transported and staged. These were stories corroborated by people inside the family, not internet rumors. They demonstrated impulse without restraint and a confidence that rules existed for others. This mattered because it explained so much else. The same internal permission that allowed those acts allowed silence to persist around addiction. It allowed inappropriate behavior to be minimized as misunderstanding. It allowed women to shoulder instability while men were described as complicated. Addiction was no longer a footnote. It was openly acknowledged, but acknowledgement arrived without full accountability. Admissions came paired with amnesia. Apologies arrived abstracted from outcomes. The family's historic approach remained intact. Admit what must be admitted. Withhold what can be withheld. Move forward. That strategy worked for decades because the family controlled access. It stopped working when family members themselves started speaking against it. The public letter marked a fracture that could not be repaired. It did not ask for reconciliation. It asked for warning to be taken seriously. It placed ethical language where political language had been expected. Predator, danger, hypocrisy. These were not words chosen casually. Their weight came from the source. This was not an attack from outside. This was a reckoning delivered from within the bloodline. The response followed familiar lines, but it landed differently. Denial sounded rehearsed. Minimization sounded tired. The audience sensed that this time the damage was already done. For the grandchildren, this moment clarified something essential. They were not inheritors of a stable institution. They were inheritors of an argument that had never been resolved. Each had to decide how much of the past to defend and how much to repudiate. Public life offered no shelter from that choice. Invoking the family history invited scrutiny. Distancing from it invited accusations of disloyalty. There was no neutral position. One grandchild continued forward into public service, discovering quickly that the name opened doors while inviting interrogation. Every move was read symbolically. Success was attributed to lineage. Failure was treated as confirmation of decay. The campaign did not collapse dramatically. It eroded. Staff exited. Momentum faltered. The project revealed a hard truth. Legacy grants access. It does not guarantee competence or cohesion. The pressure of representing a history this heavy fractured the operation where talent alone might have steadied it. Another grandchild fought a private war with a public face. The illness advanced on a schedule no legacy could interrupt. Treatments prolonged time without restoring certainty. Writing became survival. The story centered on bodies rather than ideals. It asked for compassion rather than allegiance. In doing so, it stripped the family name of its political insulation and replaced it with vulnerability. The public responded to that honesty in ways the family had not anticipated. Sympathy poured in not because of the name, but because suffering does not recognize pedigree. In the end, the facts separate from the rumors with disappointing clarity. The institutionalization of Rosemary Kennedy is historical record. The addiction admitted by family members is documented. The animal incidents were described by close relatives and corroborated over time. The allegations of inappropriate behavior were publicly stated and never resolved in court. The illnesses are real. The family fracture is real. What remains unproven should be labeled as such, but the pattern does not require embellishment to indict the system that allowed it. There is no final villain because this story is not about one person. It is about a structure that rewarded silence and punished exposure. It is about a culture that confused loyalty with complicity. It is about power used to manage outcomes rather than to repair harm. The Kennedys did not fall from grace. They lived inside a myth that hid damage long enough for the damage to multiply. What survives is not Camelot. It is the people who choose to break from the rules that sustained it. The grandchildren who speak plainly. The ones who refuse to turn pain into performance. The ones who accept that a famous name cannot substitute for moral clarity. Survival here does not look triumphant. It looks honest. It looks quieter than legacy ever allowed. The story ends where it should have begun decades earlier, with accountability not as punishment but as recognition, with the admission that greatness built on concealment corrodes everything beneath it. The myth asked America to believe. The record now asks America to remember.